Hello everyone, welcome to the re-upload of the Beyblade build, equipment and constellations. Now, this video is going to get a little bit interesting because I'm going to be talking about the constellations in and out as I cover the equipment, and you'll understand why once I talk about the second full set. Second, I'm also talking about only the end game equipment. There are a couple of pieces that go up to level 84 that I'm not going to talk about because essentially, again, they're not endgame, so they're basically filling in until you can get that endgame equipment. So I'm really not going to talk about that because they're so temporary, generally speaking, that they don't really make a huge difference. But obviously, when we're talking about the Beyblade build, I also want to clarify one other thing, is that the Beyblade build is very specifically just looking to spin, and try to avoid not spinning, right? If you're not spinning, you're not Beyblading, right? So I am going with it from that specific angle. That's how I Beyblade, right? Some of the things that I talk about here, some of the equipment that I talk about here, I will describe negatively because they don't help you stay constantly spinning, but these are excellent pieces of equipment if you're not looking to exclusively spin, you just like spinning as an option. For this video, I am assuming you want to do nothing but spin, right? Or very nearly nothing but spin. Obviously, you can't 100% spin 100% of the time. And again, we'll talk about that as time goes on. But first, I do want to talk about some constellations that I usually go into when I'm going for a Beyblade build. Now, my usual constellations, some of these are fill-ins because my constellations vary a decent bit depending on what my secondary is, but whenever I am Beyblading, I usually am making sure I have the Assassin's Blade because I want the Assassin's Mark. Now, it's very important to remember that Beyblading does physical, fire, and lightning damage by default, especially physical damage. There's a lot of physical here. Actually, both of these increase physical damage, so physical damage is pretty important, so I usually slap Assassin's Mark on, pretty much all the time. Again, there's two elements here, so I go for the Viper here, because at the end it has 20% reduced target elemental resistance, but this isn't the only reason why the Viper is pretty much a necessity for any Beyblader. You've also got the 15% chance of 36 energy leech, which helps you in the early game, if you rush to the Beyblade, like most sane Beybladers. But the 10% energy absorbed from enemy spells becomes really handy in the late game, and really pulls its weight. Now, in the mid-game, you're going to have a little bit of difficulty, because on the one hand, the energy leech will help a little bit, and on the other hand, the enemies aren't casting quite as much spells as you'd like, so you're not absorbing quite as much energy as you'd like. But that really fixes itself in the late game when enemies tended to cast more spells. The Vulture and the Spider are just fill-in, so is the Eel. Again, these are ones that I've only put in as fill-in here because I'll usually go for something more specific depending on what my full Beyblade build looks like and what my other masteries are. I usually try to include Tempest. I don't always necessarily succeed at this. Sometimes I've dropped this in favor of other things, but it is really nice where you can slap Reckless Tempest onto your Beyblade or onto something else, and you're now, stunning enemies as you're going along. But the ultimate point here is for Ultos, because he's got even more elemental resistance reduction. And of course you've got more Chain Lightning here, really. Which is quite useful. This isn't Chain Lightning. Well, not technically, but it is incredibly useful for that reason. You do have the potential to stun here as well, and this is actually the reason why Tempest is one of the first constellations I'll drop if I need to, because while Reckless Tempest is really nice, compared to the glory of Hand of Ultos, it's not quite as much damage. It's just something that I try to include if I can. If I can't, it's no big deal, but do keep that in mind. It does make for a nice stopgap until you get to Ultos, but quite frankly, I'd rather rush to Ultos than spend time and points getting Reckless Tempest. So those are really three constellations, the Viper, the Assassin's Blade, and Ultos that I usually go for. I actually almost always go for with Beyblading. I will also generally tend to go for Ulzwin's Torch, and there's a specific reason why I prefer Ulzwin's Torch over, say, physical damage from Unknown Soldier as an example. The reason is because when I Beyblade, depending on what my other mastery is, but a lot of the time I'll go for Divine Mandate, because it's increasing the physical and fire damage all in one place, and it's just conveniently right here. Furthermore, I will also often pick up Guardians of Empyrean, as I mentioned in the previous video, because you reduce physical and elemental resistance there. So the whole thing is just really nicely compacted into a beautiful little specimen here of resistance reduction and increasing your physical and fire damage. So I tend to go for Olzuin's Torch, and this is a pretty quick grab. You just finish out Slael's Witchblade, you drop Tempest, you pick up, I'll usually pick up Scholar's Light, and Magi, grab Crossroads, grab Olzuin's Torch. You know, I'll basically have a grand old time here. Maybe I don't necessarily grab Magi, maybe I grab something else. It really depends on what I'm going, you know, how I decide to construct this. But I'll usually grab Olzuin's Torch to accent that fire damage as well. Also, having meteors fall around you while you're Beyblading the enemy away is pretty handy. Pretty effective, actually. Surprisingly very effective. And just a rip-roaring good time, right? So, that's generally, you know, broad strokes Constellations for Beyblading. Now let's get into some equipment. Now, first I want to talk about the sets, and I'm going to talk about the quintessential Beyblade set. The Cyclone set. Now, this is fairly interesting, and I do have some issues with this, actually. Now, I call it the quintessential Beyblade set, because the Cyclone, you've got the spinning, you have increases to Wind Devil, right? They live for longer, you can summon an extra one, you can have a bunch running at the same time, you can have 4 running at the same time rather than 3. You've got all of this fire and lightning damage increase, you've got energy regeneration here, which is really beautiful. I mean, you've got everything you could ever dream of out of this. You've got extra weapon damage and lightning damage on Eye of Reckoning. You've got Thermite Mine increase if you're in Demolitionist instead. Pardon me. You have Thermite Mine doing full lightning damage if you're using that. You've got more additions to Wind Demon here, to Eye of Reckoning here. It becomes full electric. This is basically a full elemental Beyblade, right? Now, my problem with this is primarily the Wind Devils as a choice. Now, don't get me wrong, Wind Devils are useful overall, primarily for Raging Tempest, which reduces elemental resistance, and I appreciate that. My problem with the Cyclone as a Beyblade-focused build is that you have to stop and bust out some storms, some Wind Devils, which means you're not Beyblading when you're summoning these. And you have to summon 4 of them. Yes, they last for 20 whole seconds, but it takes you about 5 seconds to summon 4 of them anyways. So it's, well, actually it doesn't take 5. Well, it takes 5 seconds per each, you know, to bust them out. So by the time you're done summoning the last one, you're only Beyblading for a couple of seconds. I think, specifically, well, 4.5, 9, 13.5, 18, yeah. By the time you're done, you're basically just spamming Wind Devils, and then for 2 seconds you're Beyblading. That's my real problem with this. Again, if you're not exclusively looking to Beyblade, this is great. This also is pretty good with allies, and by the way, before you say, what about the Thermite Mine? It's the same scenario with the Thermite Mine. You have to stop Beyblading to throw these down. And it's, when you're looking for a Beyblade build, all you want to do is Beyblade. So, I'm not a huge fan of it, but it is interesting also, I want to point this out. This is the only offhand that enhances Eye of Reckoning, just for reference. So, just keep that in mind. It is not something that I typically Beyblade with. I actually prefer this set with a Demolitionist Shaman combination, but that's a conversation for a different video, but it's just not my favorite Beyblading set. Now, this isn't supposed to be here right here. These aren't supposed to be here yet. Get over there. There we go. Now, the Corvin Dune Fiend is actually a really excellent example of the kind of variability you have in Beyblading. This makes your Beyblade poison. Alright? It actually converts the damage, the fire damage of Eye of Reckoning to acid, and then one of these pieces of equipment, this sword here, converts the physical damage to poison. I believe it leaves the lightning alone, because it actually, the set itself converts lightning damage to acid damage anyways by itself without really needing any help. Here we have 30% converted here. Let's go minimal. We have 54% converted here. I believe there's more. Yes, we have 78 converted here. So most of your lightning damage is being converted through the set itself rather than specific pieces of equipment. Now, this actually is one of my favorite ways of Beyblading, specifically with occultists. Now, you might be curious as to, well, Professor, you've got Dune Fiend's Blade here, and then down here you've got the Dune Fiend's Slicer. What's the deal? How are you going to dual wield with an Occultist's Oathkeeper? Well, there are relics that allow you to dual wield. First off, that is something that not a lot of people remember. And whether or not that relic is useful for your build is a separate question. You may have to sacrifice the quality of your relic in order to pull this set off, but that's a choice you have to personally make. If you're going for the Occultist, obviously the Nightblade version does not have this problem. But let's talk about some of the advantages of the Poison Beyblade. Now, first off, we have total speed increase here of 10%, and we have 4 energy regeneration per second. Now, the energy regeneration obviously is going to help you Beyblade for longer, because you're recovering more energy. As you're Beyblading, you're using more energy. The total speed is really effective, because not only are you moving faster while Beyblading, but the Beyblade increases its damage output with attack speed. So if you increase your attack speed, which this is total speed, you're actually doing more damage per second while Beyblading. Now, the fact that we have Blood of Dreeg here is really great, because we actually pop over here to Occultist, and we examine the Blood of Dreeg. And we're going to do something else really quick, too. I will make this clear for a second. Just give me a second. We have Blood of Dreeg for a heal, which you can cast while Beyblading. You don't actually need to stop Beyblading to use this. And then you have Aspect of the Guardian, increasing your Poison, Acid, Vitality, and Vitality Decay damage. Now, instead of Divine Mandate, obviously, what we would instead be going for is Path of the Three, which is going to increase our Poison, Acid, and Vitality damage. Grab the Scion of Dreeg, boom, Vitality, Poison, Acid, and Bleeding damage. Bleeding resistance goes down. Lovely. We already know this is doing acid damage now, and that's just a really magical time. Now, I really don't necessarily go much farther. You could alternatively, if you really wanted to, go into Possession. I tend not to, because that's going to throw, you're having to throw more points into that, specifically 18 more points, whereas you already want to be this far up, since first off, this is only a 10-point difference here, and second off, Celestial Presence under Scion of Dreeg is incredibly useful for this build, which is fairly obvious. So I don't tend to go for that. Obviously, like I mentioned in the previous episode, Presence of Virtue is really helpful. I tend to also go for Resilience because that enhances the healing I get out of Blood of Dreeg. But, a little known fact, Soleil's Witchfire is really nice for this. And the reason why is because you'll notice it's a 15% increase in attack speed. This means that even though Soleil's Witchfire isn't enhancing your regular attacks like it's intended to, it is allowing you to do more damage Beyblading, because you're hitting more often per second. Now, I don't tend to go into second right, primarily because it doesn't really make a difference. If you're having a really hard time keeping your vitality resistance high enough to survive, maybe it's worth the points, but generally I don't necessarily go into this. What I will actually often do is go for a skill that I can use as an entry skill, and I'm going to be talking about these a lot, but an entry skill is a skill that I'll typically cast before I start the Beyblade. I'll use it as the introductory ability to weaken down the enemy, and my favorite for this is actually Curse of Frailty into Vulnerability. Is incredibly potent for this, right? It's just a really great skill. You blast the enemy with Vulnerability, and then you Beyblade them to death. That's basically how it works. If you want an alternative instead, you could go into Bloody Pox. You might stretch that out to Wasting. You could even theoretically stretch it out to Black Death, which it's totally up to you. This is an excellent opening skill as well. It really depends on your needs. I prefer Curse of Frailty and Vulnerability, but you don't have to lock yourself into that by any stretch of the imagination. The only real problem with this is, obviously, you don't have quite enough points. I usually have to drop Resilience for this, usually is where I want to go, and the reason why I'm so fine with dropping Resilience is because Presence of Virtue obviously offers the energy, which we need. So, you fill this out to Black Death for the poison and vitality damage, and this is an excellent opening move because this is percentage of health damage right here. You're doing vitality and poison with this, and bleeding, which, by the way, your Celestial Presence is also weakening down that resistance to bleeding. So it's just all across the board doing a lot of damage here, and combine that with the Beyblade, and you're actually slapping really hard. So you just cast Bloody Pox once before you start Beyblading, and it'll spread itself out to the rest of whatever group of enemies you're confronting. And then you just basically are done. It's just a matter of time. The plague is decimating them. You're spinning them to death. It's fantastic. Again, I do have a mild preference for the Weakening Curse and Vulnerability. That's a personal preference, but this is really incredible, and Bloody Pox is one of my favorite skills. I do tend to go for Vulnerability and Curse of Frailty a little bit more if I'm playing with allies, because they can also take advantage of the resistance reductions. If you're playing solo, Bloody Pox is, in the long run, probably a little bit more effective. But I did want to show this so you can really see the incredible potential Beyblade has. The only other version here would be the Nightblade, but that doesn't really do as much for me. You have Shadow Strike increases, which you might think, well, Professor, you have to interrupt your Beyblade to Shadow Strike. Yes, you do, but you're thinking of a pretty classic example here. Now, if I were, well, when I have played this, I played this particular combination once because I knew as soon as I saw that set, as soon as I saw the Dune Fiend set for the first time in my life, I knew exactly where I was going with that. I was going to go into the Occultist because it's my favorite. But when you're running this, right, you are running Shadow Strike, and you actually want to increase at least an Nadal's justifiable ends. You don't have to go farther if you don't want to. I don't usually. But regardless, notice that first off, this is actually doing poison. Again, Nightfall does vitality damage, so you can go into that if you want to. It is helpful. But at the very least, get Nadal's justifiable ends. And what you use is your entry skill, because what you're going to do is Shadow Strike into the middle of the group, and then you start Beyblading. Rinse and repeat for every enemy, right? For every group of enemies. Shadow Strike in, Beyblade to victory. Now, where you want to go after these really depends on whether or not you take this. I tend to go into Veil of Shadow and Night's Chill, primarily for the poison acid resistance down, and I tend to go into Merciless Repertoire. Maybe I'll put the spare points into Nightfall. Maybe I don't. I don't know. And again, maybe you pull out some Resilience here, put that into Nightfall. Maybe you take these points and you put them into Pneumatic Burst instead. It's totally up to you how you want to do this, ultimately, but that is how you would use Shadow Strike effectively in a Dune Fiend Poison Beyblade. Alright? Now, that being said, let's talk about the third set, which is the Warborne Bastion. Now, this is the physical Beyblade, and while there is the Olorin's Rage increase here, you'll find overall between Break Morale, Deadly Momentum, Warcry, a lot of the soldier skills interrupt the Beyblading. And again, if you're playing just an Oathkeeper soldier combination and you're not looking to Beyblade to victory, this is just an excellent set for that combination. But my personal preference when running Warborne is, in fact, going into the Necromancer, and we're just going to Spectral Binding. Now, there's a couple of very important reasons for that. First off, it's doing damage to any enemies near you over time. Second off, it's retaliating against enemies that are shooting you from a distance, which are harder to Beyblade because you actually have to get over there first. Third, it's reducing their physical resistance. Fourth, it's actually doing extra physical damage through the set, which is really nice to see. And you've got this internal heal that just happens, which is fantastic. 50% chance on attack, and you're Beyblading? Yes, please. So you can see all the physical damage increases here, attack speed increase here, which is beautiful. You've got Reaping Strike increase, which really doesn't matter. Again, you have to interrupt the Beyblade for that. So I don't often use that. We have Spectral Wrath here, Soulfire here. Lightning is converted to physical, which is what we want for Soulfire. It's just a really wonderful time. Extra physical damage to Spectral Binding. You've got it all. You've got increased crit damage. It's just, it is very interesting. Is this my favorite way to Beyblade? No, it absolutely is not. But we're going to be coming back to this set, so don't forget this by any stretch of the imagination. But now let's talk about what the specific request was about. Let's talk about Inquisitor, Oathkeeper, combination, Beyblade. Now, unfortunately, in technically bad news, there's not a whole lot of equipment supporting this, but there is two really powerful pieces for that combination. First is the Mythical Rune Topaz of Gilad? I'm not really sure how you would pronounce that. And the really big deal here is, not only does it enhance Eye of Reckoning, obviously, but Aura of Censure. Now, I've talked about this in the previous episode, where when you're running a Paladin Beyblade, you don't want the ultimate skill of the Oathkeeper. It's just not something you want. Celestial Presence is fine if you want it. Totally optional. But what you really want is Aura of Censure for its elemental reduction here. Absolutely fantastic. And then you're going to grab this beautiful Inquisitor Seal. Going to grab Arcane Empowerment. Going to go into Word of Renewal. Slap in that Word of Arms for a good time. Maybe you go into Deadly Aim, maybe you don't. Go into that Resilience, right? Again, this is basically, you know, something that I've pulled. This is basically from the previous video. But this enhances Aura of Censure. You're throwing out random replicating missiles, which while they aren't really that damaging, obviously, you get a whole bunch of these because the fragments, they happen 10% of the time. You're Beyblading, it increases attack speed. It's a really lovely time. It is converting some of your physical damage to elemental damage, but this isn't the only piece. This is just the amulet for that. Here's the belt. Now, the enhancement to Inquisitor Seal is really nice. Again, we typically use that in a Paladin Beyblade. We have Elemental Seal, which is a little bit of extra damage, but Word of Pain. This actually isn't necessarily a bad thing, and let me explain. Now, something I didn't specifically cover in the previous episode is, hey, I'm playing with friends, and I Beyblade. What if I grabbed really quick a lovely Word of Pain instead of what I normally do, and I help my allies deal even more damage through the magic of Death Sentence. Pierce, Aether, and Chaos Resistance down. Now this helps you a little bit less because obviously the Celestial Presence decreases elemental resistance, but your allies might need it. And again, kind of like Bloody Pox when I talked about that earlier, this is kind of like a smaller form of it where it's going to be doing damage over time as you're Beyblading, and it lasts a decent amount of time. It absolutely decimates a large group of enemies once you get Word of Agony running, and Death Sentence makes it last even longer than normal, plus resistance reduction. It absolutely is devastating, especially if you have allies. So really, when you're running a Paladin Beyblade, if you're playing with friends, and you're running Mythical Equilibrium and Mythical Rune Topaz, which you should be, honestly, because these don't contest at all, they work really well with the build, then, you know, playing with friends, Word of Pain. Playing alone, summon, Guardian of Empyrean, Celestial Presence. That's what you want to run. Right? You can theoretically run both, but it's a little risky, and I'll tell you why. First, you have to pull out Resilience. Second, you have to pull out Presence of Virtue, so you can boost this up, and you can get most of what you're looking for here. Right? You have this here, and then actually put the 3 points back in here for 2 energy regenerated. But this reduces your energy regeneration. Yes, you are to some extent compensating for that with Word of Arms, but the extra energy is nice. It's just a matter of how you want to run, but you can run both. But generally speaking, usually when I approach this, I'll run Guardians of Empyrean when I'm playing solo, and I'll run a Word of Pain instead if I'm playing with friends. Again, you can use both. It is nice to have both because these guys will actually enhance the damage out of Word of Pain, and of course you can cast that as your opening move before Beyblading. But these two are excellent. They really should be used together, and it's probably the most coordinated two pieces of... Well, I'll talk about another really well-coordinated one later, but this is really fantastic for Paladin Beyblades. Also, peek at that energy. I forgot to mention that. Lovely. Then we have Slayer's Helm. Now, this is obviously a meme. That goes without saying, but this actually is my preference in running a Nightblade Beyblade. Now, the interesting thing here is that, as you've probably noticed, it's doing not physical and elemental damage, it's doing Aether and elemental damage. It uses Veil of Shadow instead, obviously, which is great because you can have that active and just Beyblade to your heart's content. You'll also notice it increases Spectral Binding, so you can, in theory, still use this as well with good old-fashioned Necromancer. But the reason why you don't generally replace necessarily the Warborne Bastion with it is because obviously this has a helmet that you need to be having equipped, and for the Corvin Dune Fiend it's got the mask that you need to have equipped. Let me show you the mask really quick. The mask, so this can't replace the helmets in either of these sets, but if you have a whole bunch of random pieces of equipment that are really good for Beyblading, and you're either a Necromancer or a Nightblade, this is great, especially Nightblades. So it is really useful in that particular regard. This is the only current piece of equipment that I know of, that I can at least remember. If there's another one, let me know. But this is the only piece of equipment I know of that makes it an Aether Beyblade. Do with that what you will. But moving on, I hate this shoulder guard, at least for Beyblades. Now you'll notice that pretty much everything it enhances you have to stop Beyblading for. So again, if I'm not looking to exclusively Beyblade, it's just spinning to win is just an option I have. It's just one of my abilities. This is fine. But for Beyblading, don't touch this, because everything else it enhances doesn't matter. The stats themselves are mediocre. I mean, they're nice and all, but they're not going to affect your Beyblading specifically, and you'll probably just find random green shoulders that drop from some random enemy to be just as useful, if not more useful, as long as they enhance Eye of Reckoning. I mean, honestly, it's just not that great of a piece of equipment for Beyblading specifically. Moving right on, we have the Mythical Dawnshard Hauberk. Now, this actually is a really great way for me to introduce the glorious Demolitionist Beyblade, where you are, and I believe I mentioned this in my previous video, you are specifically running, I did not overshoot that, Flame Touched for the fire and lightning damage increase, Temper for the physical damage increase, Vindictive Flame for the total speed increase, the health regeneration, and just burning everything near you, and Ulzawan's Wrath Retaliate, and again, do more damage to people near you. Now, basically, this doubles up on your damage when Beyblading, which is really nice to see. We can absolutely cram in Resilience. You could go all the way up to Blast Shield if you want. This is just the foundations of what I usually use with the Demolitionist Beyblade. Where I go from here really depends. Sometimes I'll put some points into Virus Might just so that way I can dash in and then Beyblade afterwards. Obviously, you want Divine Mandate with this. That pretty much goes without saying. I'll usually also grab Resilience. And because the Dawnshard Hauberk is just its own piece, you can actually slap on a shield if you really wanted to and go into Haven if you want. You could go into Ascension if you're dying. You've got options, but how you approach it is up to you. But you do have these options because, oops, this enhances Temper. Now, I don't really recommend the other two. I'm sorry, not Eye of Reckoning. Primal Strike or Rune of Callistor. I mean, you can use this if you're a Paladin Beyblade, but I really don't recommend it because, again, Rune of Callistor, you have to stop Beyblading to put those down, and you have to stop Beyblading to Primal Strike. So I don't use this too often with the other two. Actually, I've only used it with the other two classes once each because I didn't like it, for Beyblading anyways. Dawnshard is nice, at the very least. It'll help keep you alive with that 10% reduced damage. It doesn't happen too often, but, I mean, you're Beyblading, so 10% chance on attack is more often than you'd think. So that's just a really interesting move there. But I do tend to use this for Demolitionists. Now moving on to the Cinder Touch. This is fantastic. Again, we have Vindictive Flame. It goes really well with the Dawnshard Hauberk. Obviously, Vindictive Flame increased here. Soul Fire, extra lightning damage. We're converting more lightning, fire damage to lightning damage, which is already happening here, just to a smaller extent. This is just a full 100%. It gives you the Cinder Wind, which is basically a fire Wind Devil, basically. You've got increased attack speed here. It just goes really lovely with the Dawnshard Hauberk, and this actually leads to this comparatively useless pair of gloves. Now, I say it's comparatively useless because compared to the Cinder Touch, you can see a difference night and day. Here, oh, we've got some increased fire damage. Magical. Increased fire damage, increased lightning damage, right? Increased attack speed. Just like Ember Touch. The problem here is, though, these three skills you don't want when you're Beyblading because, again, you have to stop the spin. You don't have to stop the spin with Cinder Touch. It enhances Vindictive Flame. Have a magical day. Alright? So, this you might equip until you get Cinder Touch. It really depends. This is a little bit easier to find, so it's very likely you will get a pair of Mythical Ember Grip Handguards before you get a pair of Cinder Touch. But this is just something you'd have equipped until you get Cinder Touch, basically. Then we have the Sand Reaver Bracers. Now, this is a bleed, I've reckoning, a bleed Beyblade. I couldn't say that for some reason. Increased attack speed, of course. Lightning damage converted to physical damage. Lots of bleeding damage involved here, right? But the problem here is that a lot of the other skills here, internal trauma, is a soldier, blood boil, it's just the skills that this enhances that aren't Beyblade interrupt Beyblade, which you don't want. Not a bad pair of gloves if you have nothing else. Actually, this is good for stopgapping until you find something better. But overall, not one of my favorite pieces of equipment to Beyblade with. The Reaper's leg guards are actually fairly useful for Nightblade Beyblades if you want to go all the way to the Blade Spirit. That's totally up to you. You could go for the Blade Spirit, because the Blade Spirits don't care about your Beyblades. They're not going to interrupt your Beyblading, because they're invincible. You know, every time you spawn into the game, you just bust out your Blade Spirits and spin with them to win. So it really depends on if you want to go that far. That's, again, a personal choice. For the Reaper's leg guards. But beyond that, I mean, I didn't use it with Soul Harvest, because obviously that's Necromancer, and obviously that's something that interrupts. Where's specifically Soul Harvest? Blood Boil. Soul Harvest, right, that's right. Again, you have to interrupt yourself to cast this. Just, you don't necessarily want to. So, moving right along, Kimmon's Sanctified Blade was actually a really interesting build for me. Because there was a stage in my Grim Dawn career where I said to myself, okay, I'm going to make a build out of every monster infrequent in the game. This is one of them. This is fairly interesting because you can actually run a fairly effective Arcanist Beyblade. And what you do is, instead of the Oathkeeper, instead of this, you run this Star Pact instead, and then you have Inner Focus for more energy, you have Mental Alacrity for more energy, you have Electra's Flash Freeze, I'll explain this in a minute, Arcane Will, 1 point here, and we have Presence of Virtue. There we go. So, the essential point of this build, as I constructed it, is obviously you have the cold lightning damage. Obviously these are intended to enhance the energy regeneration rate, but this requires some explanation. But the basic idea is you Virus Might into the middle of a group, you blast them with Electra's Flash Freeze, which with Absolute Zero decreases both physical and fire damage. Not that that's necessarily the biggest deal when some of your damage is being converted to lightning, but not a whole lot of it. I have Reckoning's physical damage is being converted, but that's about it. But this decreases physical and fire, but it decreases the fire extra, so the fact that we're not using the physical resistance down here doesn't matter. But you dash in with Virus Might, you freeze everyone, you spin to win. You decimate them all that way, right? And that's really how I approached this. The Mirror of Arioctes, by the way, you could also go into if you really want to. Sometimes I do, sometimes I don't. If I had to take a choice of what I would pull out, it would be Arcane Will, go into Mirror of Arioctes, which will just keep you alive. It'll retaliate against enemies. It's just a precautionary measure. You don't need it. But with this being said, I'm actually going to take a brief moment now that we've talked about some different builds and talk back about devotion points. No, I'm going to wait, actually. I want to wait for a specific piece of equipment, which is coming up. Now, the Mythical Firebrand, again, has the same problem as a lot of other things. It enhances Fire Strike Flames of Ignifar, Endless Flame. All of those interrupt the Beyblade, and Flamebrand, -8 Aether Resistance, you're not going to need a lot of the time. So it's just not something I use for Beyblading. The Mythical Reaver's Claw, this is interesting because it is converting a certain amount of Eye of Reckoning to pierce damage, but it still doesn't really make a difference because a lot of these things are just not... I mean, Ring of Steel interrupts the Beyblade. Cadence interrupts the Beyblade. I just don't use this very often for Beyblading. The Rift Claw Slicer is, again, this kind of goes back to the idea of the Warborne. Just the only difference here is that it's not actually part of a set, so you're a little bit more free with what else you build, which is fine. Moving on, Mythical Agony. This, again, does the acid version of Eye of Reckoning. Now, I don't usually use this primarily because, compared to the Corvin Dune Fiend set, this is chump change. So I don't use this very often. I've used it once to test it, but I still prefer the Dune Fiend. It was just a weaker Dune Fiend. Then we have Chillheart, which does make Eye of Reckoning cold. But again, we have Ring of Steel as a recommendation here. I have used this somewhat effectively with specifically the... now I've lost my train of thought. But Ring of Steel does interrupt the Beyblade, so that's not great. That's right, the Inquisitor can sometimes be really nice with this, because you're still doing the, the cold damage. But overall, this is another weapon that I really pass on a lot of the time. The Firestorm Scepter, everything I said about the Mythical Firebrand applies to the Firestorm Scepter. Same deal, just even weaker. Mythical Empyrean's Mercy. Again, I don't use this a ton because of Horn of Gandar. Now, again, we can use actually the Virus Might strategy to make that an entry tactic. Right? You dash in with Virus Might, you blast the horn in their face, and they're all stunned and confused. Right? That's the basic idea. So, it does have that. It has the potential for a lot of attack speed increase here, which is really nice. Just a very interesting weapon, not bad at all. Then we have the only shield that enhances Eye of Reckoning, which is the Mythical Grave Touch. Now, again, we're seeing some enhancements to Veil of Shadow. This is usually how I prefer to play it, because, again, Drain Essence interrupts you. You've got Night's Chill up here. You've got Blitz in case you want to have a soldier over, but that's entirely, different. That's up to you. We have a lot of interesting enhancements here between Vitality and Elemental. It's just very interesting. Is it necessary? No, but you do have the option, if you want to, of utilizing Safeguard if you really need to, or even throwing your shield as your entry move, as your opening ability. So you could do that as well. Overall, do I use this a ton? No, it does have the really nice 4 energy regeneration per second, but overall, it was just too much. Overall, it really depends whether or not you like this on what's going on, because again, we have elemental and vitality damage, which we don't inherently do a lot of, and the only real problem here is that basically you have to change whether or not this is reducing elemental or vitality damage, which is not necessarily a conundrum you want to be in, and the Inquisitor doesn't have any better options either, so it just kind of is like, well, what's the point of this specifically? So there is that. I don't use this very often. This is something I'd be more likely to use with an Inquisitor Soldier combination. I may try that one day. I'm sorry, not that. I'm sorry, I'm talking about the Grave Touch. You've got Drain Essence here. You can bust that out. Blitz, Soldier, Necromancer. I just don't use it with Beyblading very often. This is a piece that I really want to talk about. This is the Chaos Beyblade. Alright, now, if you recall from my last video on the Beyblading, you will probably remember, hey, he talked about wanting two-handed weapons, and we haven't really talked about a whole lot of them because for some reason there's not a whole lot of two-handed weapons that enhance Eye of Reckoning. But Tenebris does. And Tenebris is huge. First off, all this chaos damage goes into the Beyblade. Right? 28% weapon damage. Large amount of attack speed increase. Then we have Eye of Reckoning, physical damage converted to chaos damage, fire damage converted to chaos damage. Lovely time. We have huge Doom Bolt boosts here. And the reason why that's important is because you use Doom Bolt as your intro ability. So you just Doom Bolt the strongest enemy and you Beyblade the rest of them. Is basically the idea here. This absolutely slaps. I don't even need to show you anything out of the class at all. This is just incredibly potent. One of my favorite ways of playing Beyblade, actually, because it's just a lot of fun being a red, chaotic Beyblade of Death. On that note, there's actually a ring here that goes really well with Tenebris, which is the Entropic Coil. Increases chaos and fire damage. It busts out entropy. It increases Eye of Reckoning and Slael's Witchfire. And as we discussed earlier with the Occultist, Slael's Witchfire enhances our attack speeds. That's actually a really useful ring for all these reasons. It's an absolutely fantastic time. To go back to some of the rings we passed over, We have the Slayer Stormfire Ring, which again doesn't really enhance much here. This is really a stopgap because the stats are good here and it increases the Beyblade. But definitely a temporary ring. Then we have the Bilgothian's Sigil, which, again, a lot of these skills that you're seeing here just take up space, time, and are distracting. If, you know, these all just distract away from the Beyblade. Whirling Death, Markovian's Advantage, Bilgothian's Shears, you all have to stop Beyblading for this. Now, it is useful for the burst of speed that occasionally happens, but it's not so much of a deal that it's necessarily you want to have this equipped the whole time. Again, this is something you'd stopgap for, or with. Then we have this. Now, I saved this up for last because, frankly, this can work with pretty much everything. Now, I want to talk about this specifically because when you forge this, you have a chance of it being able, of the conduit, of being able to enhance Eye of Reckoning anywhere from 1 to 3 skill points. Not 1 to 3, yeah, 1 to 3. So we can enhance Eye of Reckoning by a decent bit, so it is worth mentioning there. And because it doesn't enhance any specific type of damage, any build that doesn't have an amulet already included, you can forge this and use this as well, and that's actually a huge boost, especially with +1 skills to all Oathkeeper, that it also affects Eye of Reckoning and Eye of Reckoning and my brain cramp. Soulfire. So you've got a lot of potential here with this being really useful as a filler amulet. A filler amulet so good that you may not even replace it, right? So there is that. And yeah, overall, this is an absolutely interesting piece here. But now, to clean up the video, now we've talked about the equipment, let's go back into the devotion points and kind of capstone this. Now, I talked about this in the context of a standard, good old-fashioned Beyblade, but obviously, we talked about some other ones. Now, if you're going for the Chaos Beyblade, obviously you're going into the Abomination instead. You're going to drop Ultos, you're going into the Abomination. That pretty much goes without saying, that's fairly obvious. It's not too difficult to switch over if you want to. If you're going for the Aether one, then you need the Widow, especially since I believe the Aether Beyblade does lightning and Aether damage. If you're doing the Poison Acid setup, Ugol is definitely going to be potentially on the board here. You could also instead use the Abomination for that if you want to. If you are going to be running a Poison Beyblade, though, you need Murmur. You need Rumor, get that Poison Acid resistance. You might want to go into Affliction. It's very useful for Vitality, Decay, and Acid damage, and it's just a really lovely time. But you've got all these options. If you are going for a Poison Beyblade, also you've got the Rat, you've got the Scorpion that you can fall back on. As well. The Aether, of course, really wants the Widow, as I just mentioned. And generally, yeah. Not a huge amount of difference. And then the physical Beyblade is actually going to want to go into Azraka, Unknown Soldier, and or Oleron. So, really, that's basically it, really, honestly. So, with that being said, if you like this, please like and subscribe. If you didn't, please ignore me. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, ideas, suggestions, or requests, please leave them down in the comment section below. And thank you all very much for joining me, and have a great 24 hours.